Hey everybody, and welcome back to Submarine History. So today, we're going to talk about the failure of Navy and Marine radios during Operation Galvanic, the Battle of Tarawa, an issue that usually only gets mentioned in passing in historical accounts. Read the description to this briefing. It has relevant related references and links. I have a Discord as well, and there's an invitation link on the channel banner. Finally, thank you to the United States Naval Institute for all they do preserving and promoting world naval history. There are two significant references for this briefing. First, an article from the Warfare History Network website titled Tarawa Radio Failure by Peter Macquarie. The second reference is the actual operational plan for Operation Galvanic. The ops plan is fascinating reading, and it pretty much covers everything related to the organization and execution of that operation. It's 338 pages long, with the communications plan itself being 215 pages. So obviously, it's not practical to do a deep dive on the ops plan itself, and I'm just pulling bits of information from it. But for those who want to take that dive, I have a link in the description to this briefing where you can download the operational plan, as well as a link to the article by Mr. Macquarie. Why Tarawa? In 1943, the U.S. Navy was looking down the road and knew that they needed airstrips in the Marianas to fly missions into the Philippines and Japan. To do that, the U.S. needed airstrips in the Marshall Islands to support those future assaults against the Marianas. That's why the Gilbert Islands, where Tarawa Atoll is at, was selected for invasion, because Tarawa was close enough that aircraft flown from there could support those operations against the Marshall Islands. Galvanic involved three separate operations in the Tarawa Atoll: an assault against Makin, Betio, and Abemama between 20 and 23 November 1943. The Makin and Betio invasions are the primary focus of this ops plan for Galvanic, with the Abemama operation kind of a sideshow because of the small number of personnel involved. Makin was assigned to the 165th Regimental Combat Team of the U.S. Army's 27th Infantry Division. Betio was assigned to the 2nd, 6th, and 8th Regiments of the 2nd Marine Division. Abemama was assigned to a company of Marine Scouts who were inserted by the USS Nautilus SS-168, a V-class submarine. We'll be talking about the V-class boat soon, but today we're focusing on the Marines and radio at Betio. And then here's a close-up of the red beaches. And then this is actually an excerpt, a page from the actual operation plan, and it kind of lays out the order of battle for the invasion of Betio. Okay, so I'm just going to read this slide. This kind of like sets the stage for how they're going to do communications during the invasion. So the USS Maryland BB-46, that's the command and control ship for the Southern Attack Force. That's Task Force 53, and they're operating HF and VHF radios. And the Southern Attack Force, that's Betio. Each Marine battalion is provided one TBX high-frequency radio for communications with USS Maryland. And then each Marine battalion is provided one Navy Shore Fire Control Party and one Naval Liaison Officer. And these Shore Fire Control Parties use one SCR 284 high-frequency radio. And then each Marine company is provided with one TBY VHF radio for communication within the battalion. Each Marine battalion and company is provided with sufficient EE-8 field telephones for landline communications. And then finally, Marine tanks were equipped with RU-GF high-frequency radios for communication between the tanks. So what were the problems experienced by the Navy and the Marines during the operation? Well, Maryland had been badly damaged at Pearl Harbor, but she was able to return to service in time to participate at Tarawa as the Southern Force flagship. As such, she's crucial to the operation because that's where the command staff directed the operation. So pretty much all the communications went through Maryland, except probably fire support requests, which would go directly to the ships assigned that role. Maryland had been fitted with new radio equipment just before the operation, but no testing under battle conditions had been performed to verify the radio installations. During the invasion, anytime Maryland fired her 16-inch guns, the shock would knock out her radio systems. And I'm not sure what the specific problem was, whether it was blown vacuum tubes or another problem, but the radio systems required constant repair during the operation, greatly impacting her ability to function in that command and control capacity. The invasion of Tarawa was different from the operations in the Solomon Islands in that Tarawa would be the first time it was expected that the Japanese would actively oppose a seaborne invasion. Conducting an opposed seaborne invasion is difficult enough, and that was further complicated by the tide being lower than expected, causing landing craft to run aground on coral reefs in the lagoon. And this caused a lot of Marines to go over the side and wade the shore, soaking or submerging the radios they carried. The TBX radio was procured by Betio ships as early as 1939 from a variety of contractors. By 1943, it was considered, maybe not obsolete, but it was definitely older technology. At Tarawa, the problem with the TBX was that the two-piece radio case had a simple rubber gasket to seal the cover to the radio box. While the radios were considered splash-proof, they weren't considered water-resistant or waterproof. And these were portable radios carried by 4 men. One man carrying the radio, another carrying the battery, a third man carrying a hand-operated generator, and the fourth man carrying the antenna. And the total weight of this package is around 100 pounds. Out of the initial 6 TBX radios to go ashore, only one made it to the beach in working order, on Red Beach 3, where the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines landed. That one working TBX radio would relay most of the message traffic to and from the beach to Division HQ on the USS Maryland, until a 2nd TBX radio was eventually brought online later in the operation. By the way, note the Navajo code talkers who were present at Tarawa, and in the picture they're shown operating a TBX radio. So next up, the TBY. These radios were also procured by Betio ships, starting in 1940, again from a variety of contractors. It was considered advanced for its time when it went into production. It was, quote, lightweight, weighing only 30 pounds, and being in the VHF band, it could use a much smaller antenna, making it less conspicuous on the battlefield. The TBX radios used a 24-foot tall vertical antenna, and that will get you a lot of attention. It was a complete unit consisting of the radio and the battery, making it well suited for mobile operations. However, like with the TBX, it didn't undergo rigorous testing under battlefield conditions, and the case wasn't waterproof or watertight, as it, again, like the TBX. There were other issues with the radio related to its design, which made it difficult for operators to tune and keep it set on frequency, but, it's what they had at the time. Now, from my reading, it sounds like almost none of the TBY radios were operational during the battle, which had to be frustrating for the Navajo code talkers who were supposed to work those radios during the battle. And on the slide, also note again the Navajo code talkers working the TBY radio. The EE-8 field telephone system was intended to provide a secure landline communication option for Marines in the field. It consisted of the individual hardwired phones and a switchboard to allow communication between platoon, company, and battalion elements. These phones also ended up in the water, and it required the phone operators to actually disassemble the phones in order to air dry them on the battlefield before they could be used. For the invasion, one company of M4 Sherman tanks were attached to the 2nd Mardiv for a total of 14 tanks. These tanks had been fitted with Navy RU-GF radios, which were normally fitted in aircraft. These were HF radios, so while it made it possible for the tanks to communicate amongst themselves, these radios couldn't communicate with the TBY radios that were being used by the Marines on the ground. Since the TBY was a VHF radio, and the RUGF was an HF. On top of that, at this point in time, the tanks don't have a telephone call box at the rear for infantry to use to communicate with a buttoned-up tank. Even though they were radios normally installed in aircraft, those RUGF radios, they couldn't even communicate with aircraft at Tarawa because the aircraft were using more modern radios. And that's like the ARA, ATA, or the AN/ARC5 radio series, which operated in the VHF band. So all in all, even though a lot of time went into the development of the communications plan for the overall operation, the ball was definitely dropped at the tactical level, with apparently little understanding of the need for ruggedized radios that could all communicate on a common band and modulation. So what about the Navy shore fire control parties? Did they experience the same problems? Apparently not, as when you read historical accounts, fire missions were being successfully called and answered. These SFC parties were using the SCR-284 radio, which was one of many types of SCR radios procured by the Army through the Signal Corps during the war. Unlike the Navy radios, the Army did make sure its radios underwent shock testing and demonstrated adequate water resistance. Now notice this radio is big like the TBX. This is not the case where the Naval Liaison Officer is crawling up to the front lines, calling in fire missions and adjusting fire. The SFC party would be at the battalion HQ, and fire support requests would have had to come from the TBY radio operators supplied to the companies or through telephone landlines to the SFC so they could relay the fire support request to the assigned ships. So while the Marines had the Navajo code talkers to obscure plain language radio transmission, the SFC parties used the shackle code in their plain language radio transmissions to obscure key information within that plain language message. This page is also from the ops plan. On the left is a simple substitution code that changed daily, and on the right are some examples of how to employ the code. I'm not going to go through the procedure, but you can stop the briefing and you can study the slide. You should be able to read it. Now, did the Army experience the same radio problems as the Navy during the campaign? It doesn't seem so, as the Army had its own design, testing, and procurement pipeline for the SCR radio series. I've included this slide because most of us have seen these two radios in World War II movies, and that's kind of what we think about when we think about like radio on the battlefield. On the left is the SCR 300. This was a modern radio set, entering production in 1942. In the Pacific, it was used for the first time by the Army in the New Georgia campaign in 1943. And on the right is the iconic SCR 536, the original walkie-talkie, which entered service in 1941. I have a table on the next slide that compares the capabilities of the radios that we've talked about. Let's take a look at that. Okay, and here we have the radios. It shows the model, the band that it operated, the type of modulation it used, the power, the frequency range, and then the year it entered service. The TBX, TBY, RUGF, and SCR-284, those were all used at Tarawa. In the yellow, I'm just including, these radios were not used at Tarawa, but I'm just kind of including them here as a comparison so you can see how the capabilities and stuff changed. So what were the radio lessons learned at Tarawa? Well, there were a number of them. First, to ensure radio systems can be transported to shore with minimal exposure to seawater. Ensure that radio systems are sufficiently resistant to seawater. Ensure shipboard radio systems are tested and verified for operation under battle conditions for future operations. Provide tanks with radio systems compatible with infantry radio systems. So we're talking, VHF and frequency FM modulation. And then provide tanks with a telephone that infantry can use to guide tanks and direct their fire in a protected fashion while under battle conditions. So this is a direct quote from the McQuarrie article from Warfare History Network website. Overall, the failure of telecommunications at Tarawa can be summed up by the comments of Captain McWethy of the 1st Battalion 8th Marines in his after-action report. And he says, "We lost all of our TBYs in the water. All field telephones were ruined. 2 TBX were landed, and one which was used for air liaison. Each assault company had 4 handset radios, and they were all put out of commission by seawater." Ultimately, the solution was for Army SCR radios to work their way into the Navy and Marine Corps organizations, but this did take time, and some of these older Navy radios were still being used a year later at Saipan. Now, later in the war, we'd see the introduction of the AN/PRC family of radios, and that stands for Army-Navy Portable Radio Communications. And this was a family of radios that were jointly developed and intended to be used by both the Army and the Navy. So that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you leave your questions and comments below, come over to the Submarine History Discord and say hi. Till next time, peace out.